MakeReal specialises in creating immersive learning solutions across a range of technologies. To download their latest academic paper on how to turn learners into activists, visit makereal.co.uk/activists. Ice fields are melting, coral reefs are bleaching, and a third of Pakistan is underwater. World leaders don't seem able to do anything, so how about you? What are you doing as a learning professional to fight climate change? Welcome to The Learning Hack, a podcast about the people and technologies that are creating the future of learning. I'm John Helmer.
Now guess what?
Learning is cool. Learning is cool. Learning is cool. I'm learning. Learning is fun.
And knowledge is power.
Knowledge.
Education.
Historian Adam Tooze says we're in a polycrisis, lots of different crises happening at the same time. Others call it a permacrisis, but that doesn't seem right to me. Most of the crises won't be permanent. We found vaccines for COVID. Inflation will probably turn down in a year or two. Who knows, maybe the job market will sort itself out. But there is one crisis that really won't go away, the defining crisis of our era, global warming. Successive COPs have revealed a sad lack of will among the world's governments to make commitments that they'll actually stick by. So increasingly, people who aren't in government feel it's down to them to do something. Kids walk out of school and go on marches, protesters glue themselves to roads, and every institution and organisation of any size, it seems, has an environmental policy now. Policies that it falls to HR and L&D and educators of all stripes to communicate. Learning professionals are intimately involved in combating the climate crisis. So what's the best way for them to do it? What will really have an effect? We asked a climate scientist.
Hack Facts.
Robert Nicholls is Professor and Director of the Tyndall Centre for Climate Change Research, based at the University of East Anglia. He has contributed extensively to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, the body which was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 2007. His particular focus is the implications of sea level rise, especially on coastal areas. He has published over 200 peer-reviewed papers and is the co-editor of 6 books.
Yes, a real live climate scientist. Nothing to do this time for Jay Curtis' set of themes, because really there was just one big theme to our discussion, the continued survival of humans as a species on this planet. But I think you'll find my conversation with Professor Nicholls a lot less gloomy than the rather lugubrious introduction I've given it. You might even come away from this episode feeling slightly hopeful for our chances. Dr. Nicholls, welcome to The Learning Hack.
Oh, well, good morning. It's great to be here.
While we're recording this, COP27 is underway in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt, where Antonio Guterres, the United Nations Secretary General, kicked off the conference by saying, "We are on a highway to climate hell with our foot still on the accelerator," reported all over the news. You've worked with the IPCC, a body which in the past has been accused both of underplaying the issue of climate change and by others of over-egging it. As a scientist, as a very distinguished climate scientist, would you say that Mr. Guterres' words were over the top, or did he get it about right?
Well, I won't answer that directly. I suppose what I'd say is the world we've had the aspiration within the Paris Agreement of keeping temperatures below 2 degrees and hopefully nearer to 1.5. And I really think the 1.5 target probably is out the window the way we're going at the moment. And even keeping temperatures below 2 degrees based on the way people are behaving and the way governments are behaving is also going to be extremely challenging and difficult. So at the present time, we're probably heading to somewhere near 3 degrees if we kind of continue as we are. And that assumes that all the pledges that have been made are actually followed through. So talk is cheap. Action always is a bit more costly. So I think that he's capturing in his words the fact that The governments of the world have signed up to the Paris Agreement, but then the actual delivery of it is seems quite elusive where we are at the moment, and much more action is needed to get to the sort of 2 degrees or somewhere close to the 2 degrees. In terms of climate hell, I mean, I think he's really just communicating the fact that that governments are ignoring this issue. Really, there's a collective lack of action, and it goes across the piece. Really, I mean, I'm not going to point fingers at particular countries. I think really it is a collective problem, and he's right to, I think, use that kind of language to point out this significant mismatch, shall we say, between what countries have stood up for at Paris and what they're actually doing.
It feels terrible, actually, to say that the thing we're worried about now is the 3 degrees, because they were always one of my favourite groups. But what is the effect of this 3 degrees going to look like? Do you think if the 1.5 is really out of the window, what can we expect to see if governments continue in the current path?
Well, I think as climate, I mean, there's talk of tipping points. So I think this is the worrying thing about climate change, or about really, I suppose, any kind of change, really, that as you kind of turn up the volume, shall we say, things suddenly start to change dramatically. So you for example, coral reefs at about 1.5 degrees will probably start to die very widely around the world, because they can't right now. When you get a very high temperature, coral reefs bleach. Corals live in a symbiotic relationship with an algae within their bodies, and they actually push the algae out, and then they then hopefully reabsorb it, or if they don't, they die. And with a little bit more warming, they're living at the top of their temperature threshold. It would seem that we're going to see the loss of living coral very widely, not everywhere, because there'll be some places where coral can continue to live, but there'll be a really significant change. So that is maybe one of the tipping points that one is talking about. And obviously, I mean, a world with a great loss in coral reefs, that sounds a pretty awful world to be living in. As we get warmer, so we get more and more changes of this type. I think it's fair to be said that some of these changes, not all of them are perfectly understood. So there's a bit of uncertainty around this. But I think we would see increasing melting of land-based ice. So we'd see more sea level rise. We'd see plants and animals that live at tops of mountains, they've got nowhere to go as the world warms. So extinctions of and significant movements of species to higher latitudes. This would happen in the ocean as well, as the ocean would be warming as well as the land. And I think on a human scale, heat stress, I think probably right now in the world, there's nowhere that's really uninhabitable by humans, in the sense that there's nowhere where it gets so hot that it would kill you. We're now reaching a threshold where if the wet bulb temperature rises above 35 degrees centigrade, if that happens, humans die through heat stress. You just can't lose enough heat. So that's also a concern, that certain parts of the world, these temperatures have been observed now for short periods in small places, and they weren't observed in the past. So we're talking about areas in the southeast United States, in India, in Pakistan, in sort of North Africa, where these temperatures, and maybe also in places like Thailand, where these temperatures could be sustained for significant parts of the day. So that means that people couldn't work outside. It would be fatal. And so, you'd have to retreat into air conditioning, which is maybe in itself, obviously, an energy-using technology. Yeah. But that would be the only way to survive. So, I think I've just given you a flavour there. I mean, it's a world that's going to be quite different to the world that we live in today, and I think a less desirable world, but a world I particularly want to live in.
Your particular specialisation, which you touched on there, is the consequences of climate change for coastal areas. We perhaps hear less about this in the media than other aspects of warming. Should we be more attentive to that? To what extent is this a future risk, something away in the future, or something that's going to devastate the coral reefs? Well, is that going to affect people who are, just trying to get to work on the M25? Or is it something that's already having catastrophic effects? I mean, when it comes to coastal things, I should say I'm sitting here in Brighton in a coastal town, not too worried about flooding. We get quite a bit of flooding where I am anyway, because the water comes down off the downs. But how can you bring this kind of closer to people understanding the risks to them?
Well, I think the big effect in coastal areas is sea level rise. So sea levels are rising at the present time. So it is something that's happening now. So sea levels rose something like 20 centimeters in the 20th century. They're now rising at about 4.4 millimeters per year at the present time, based on satellite measurements. Why are they rising? Because the ocean is warming, so it's expanding. So that's the same mass occupies a larger volume as it warms up, and land-based ice is melting. So the small glaciers in the Alps is a place where glaciers are in retreat. But particularly concerning is Greenland and Antarctica, and sort of Greenland in the last few decades has become a significant source of sea level rise. So the Greenland ice sheet is contracting, and there's concerns now. And Antarctica now is also a source of sea level rise. In the 20th century, the main sources were thermal expansion and the small glaciers. So we are seeing these big ice sheets coming into play in terms of the rise. So 4 millimeters per year in itself, a year of sea level rise isn't worth worrying about. 4 millimeters, you can barely notice it, but it accumulates. I think that's so it's something that steadily builds. So if that was sustained for 100 years, that's 40 centimeters of change. I mean, that's more of a foot in the old-fashioned way of talking about things. And that does start to exacerbates flooding in coastal areas. It encourages erosion. It pushes salt water further inland. In the case of Brighton, 40 centimeters of sea level rise would be increasing the flood risk on the coast. It would be causing the beaches that protect you, that you probably use for your recreation in the summer.
Not again.
It would cause those to erode and reduce. So it's having adverse effects. Probably the more important places, though, actually, than Brighton. If you come round to East Anglia or into London, there are huge areas, or not so far from you, just around Eastbourne, Pevensey levels. There are large areas which are very low near to sea along the coast, where the sea, if it actually floods, could go far inland and flood large numbers of properties. So that is probably the main concern in terms of what we're worried about, that this really could impact large numbers of people. Probably today, 200 million people live in what we call the coastal floodplain. And as time goes forward, the number of people in the coast is going up because there's more people, and people tend to be moving to the coast. So there is a growth in population globally. I'm talking here, but and then so sea level is making all those people more at risk of flooding and catastrophe.
We're currently in an energy crisis caused by the war in Ukraine, having just come out of the crisis that was the pandemic. People in the UK are turning off their radiators, they're putting on an extra jumper, and we don't know yet how wide-ranging or long-term the effects of all these price rises in energy might be. Would you expect that the energy crisis could be a driver for more green behaviours and investment in renewables? In other words, people start to kind of look seriously at reducing their energy consumption just purely to lower their bills, and governments start to move towards renewables? Or is this more likely to be a statistically unimportant blip, do you think?
I think it's a great opportunity to sort of think about energy security. I think one of the ways to really to really answer this challenge of reducing greenhouse gas emissions is to try and merge agendas. So I think this is exactly your question is talking about, that the energy security issue can merge with reducing emissions. So I think I think in some ways it's an opportunity. It's really made people think about energy in a way that I think last year, or but before the Ukraine invasion, people took it for granted, didn't they? Really, you press the button and heat, your radiators are warm, or hot water comes out of the tap.
Yeah.
And so it's a great opportunity, but I think we shouldn't just assume it will happen. It equally could fuel people who say we have immediate problems. This climate change stuff's all far in the future. You get short-termism.
We're seeing a lot of that, aren't we, around the energy crisis as well? We need to keep these coal-fired power stations going so that we've got, enough kind of electricity coverage.
Well, absolutely. Well, Germany has stopped phasing out coal-fired power stations as a result. In Britain, I think we're bringing them back on. In Germany, maybe it's nuclear as well. I was thinking they've kept their nuclear power stations going on a bit further than they planned. So, and I think using coal in the short term is fine. I mean, but the point is, you don't want it to become a long-term, locked-in solution to this problem, which is so. So I think there are great opportunities there, but one has to see the dangers that it could actually mean that it sort of could derail these activities. I think that what we see, renewables in Britain have grown as a proportion of our energy, and that I think the economics of that now is really pushing it. I mean, wind and solar have become much cheaper than people expected, much more quickly. And I suppose that, therefore, so I am, well, my background's in engineering, so I suppose I do think that we need, technology is going to be a big part of the solutions that we in this space. And I think that it's really trying to make it a no-brainer that these types of solutions are the right way to go. So back to your question, I think this encourages reflection on these issues. And I think it's really important to try and target that so it's pushing us in the right direction in the long term, and recognizing there will be some people who will be wanting to push in a different direction. So there's always politics in everything that's done in society. Yeah. So I think and I think it's easy to think sometimes that on any issue that the battle is won. And I think it never is. I think it's always an ongoing debate, and there's always going to be somebody saying we should be doing something different. And I think the fight has to always be had, and you always have to be ready to remind people why you're following a certain route.
Staying with those themes for just a little bit before we move on, I'd like to talk more about engineering and engineered solutions. But first of all, on this theme, we recently learned during the incredibly short reign of our last Prime Minister that there is something called the Anti-Growth Coalition. Are you a member? Is one question. The serious point, is there an inbuilt contradiction between our fixation on growing GDP year on year and the need to rein back on climate impact? Is there, when you look at this kind of coldly, really, is there a head switch we need to make here and to stop focusing so much on growth?
That's a very interesting question that's much bigger than climate change, really, because it goes to the heart of what society's kind of goals are. Because, I mean, certainly we live in a growth-focused world at the moment, and it's the key indicator. And I suppose thinking of indicators that look at people's well-being, I mean, maybe we should be trying to think about what are the things that give people happiness, make them feel good, give them a great life, if you like. So I'm not. I wouldn't say I'm against growth, but I am interested in this idea of how can we deliver what people want. I mean, I've done a lot of work in developing countries, in places like Bangladesh in particular, is a place I've worked in a lot, but I've been elsewhere as well. And these places are clearly quite poor. They do need growth in the traditional sense. So I think we have to look at that. There's issues around distribution of wealth, and also, but then looking more widely at what can actually make people happy, give a sense of well-being. But I think the world, though, is very fixated on growth, and I think it'll be a brave politician who kind of goes, can you take it, particularly in a democracy, to actually follow these sort of strategies? So I think we have to sort of look both. So sort of intellectually, I think it's very interesting to think about these other ways of moving forward, and it makes sense that I think at some point people are. More wealth, I've read, makes you happy up to a point, and then
£50,000 a year. I think there's a study a while ago, several years ago now, so that might have changed. We've got a bit of inflation now, but a study I think said that once you had £50,000 a year, you were happy. Anything larger than that only made very little addition to your.
Yeah, well, it's absolutely. So I mean, there is this sort of threshold where really it doesn't have much effect, and it's other things that could make you could affect your quality of life. I'm very interested in exploring this, but I think that there has to be I mean, really, this is maybe the interesting thing about climate. It opens up a lot of societal questions about how we organize ourselves, what our values are, what we really want to achieve in the longer term. And right now we're in a very individualistic world where we give great freedom to sort of individuals. Elon Musk, I mean, we all know the name, and they're having a huge amount of effect on us, and there are other and the world allows that, and I suppose that's brought some great things to the world, but I think it is worthwhile questioning that and saying, where do we want to go? But the world is going to keep changing. I mean, I think we want to move forward, because I think at times when I hear about growth, I sometimes get a sense that some people are nostalgic for something that we've lost, and I think we're on a journey to somewhere new. So in that sense, I think we need to change and grow into the future, but quite what that growth means could be different to what it has meant in the past.
Yeah. Interesting answer, and it may be the question goes well even beyond politics to human psychology. Is this kind of urge to increase your own GDP year on year maybe a kind of part of human psychology that may be indispensable? I'm sure libertarians would say it is. In the struggle against the forgetting curve that learning people are engaged in every day, there are no magic formulas, but there is science. For well over a century, psychologists have known that the spacing effect unlocks deep learning and helps learners power through to peak performance. And yet who uses it, despite the fact that modern learning systems like LXPs make it almost easy? I've written a white paper with Learning Pool that shows how you can use the spacing effect to beat the forgetting curve. Download it now. The Learning Hack podcast is supported by Learning News, the learning sector's newswire. Rob and his team are good friends of the podcast, and we really value the help and advice we've had from them, and they do a great job. For the very latest news from around the learning sector, for interviews with learning leaders, the latest from learning sector vendors and features on workplace learning, go to learningnews.com. This is a learning podcast, and I took the opportunity at a recent learning conference, the autumn session of Learning Technologies Conference, to crowdsource my questions to you, because I felt a bit at sea, no pun intended. What would you ask a climate scientist? I said to everybody. And for the rest of this interview, I'd like to put a few of the questions that came back to you. And the first of those, how much confidence should we put in the idea that engineering solutions are going to get us out of trouble?
Well, I think I said in an earlier answer, I think technology is going to be well, I'm an engineer, but technology is, I think, going to be a big part of the solution. I think when we are seeing engineering coming into play. I mean, all the renewables. I mean, these are all new technologies. All the windmills. I mean, you've got windmills to the south of you in Brighton, haven't you? I'm not sure what it's called,
Absolutely.
but I've seen them, and solar as well. So these are all technology there is stepping up and providing new options. So I think I'm not quite sure if in this question that's what they're getting at, but there's also engineering to adapt as well. I suppose that's and maybe they're talking about that. And certainly, I think engineering can help us with adaptation. I mean, like the Thames Barrier, for example, is a kind of iconic piece of engineering that keeps London dry at the moment. And the challenge, I suppose, to engineering solutions is, can they keep pace with the rates of change? So that's maybe the key kind of question. And I wouldn't want to depend entirely on engineering. I think but I think engineering has quite an important role, or maybe a fundamental role, to play in finding solutions. And I think that needs to be put into a societal context, so that we're solving societal problems rather than you have a widget that's searching for something it can solve.
Yeah, I think partly behind this question is, I think I know the person who posed it. There's this thing that, is worried about an attitude where people say, well, let's not worry too much about this because we're very clever and we can invent technological solutions. I don't know, nap-arming the clouds to provide more cloud cover or something to stop the warming. We'll come up with something that will get us out of trouble, have a get-out-free jail card due to our engineering know-how. And that kind of creates a certain level of complacency.
I think, right. Okay. Thank you for the clarification. I think we should not put confidence in that type of engineering, the sort of the get out of jail free card, essentially, that I can just keep on going as I am. No, I think that really as a society, we've got to engage with this. This is a fundamental challenge. There's the term geoengineering, where actually you try and modify climate to make it cooler.
Yeah.
And for example, if you emit aerosols, which are like coal-fired power stations, actually they produce carbon dioxide, which cause global warming. But the aerosols they put out actually cause global cooling, because they actually sulfur dioxide actually radiates back some sunlight, and also it creates clouds. So there are effects, but that aerosol effect is quite short term. It doesn't persist for very long, but you can influence the climate to make it cooler. And people have talked about mirrors in space, where you try and actually absorb, I don't know, 5% of the sun's input or something like that, and a certain amount, and then you can lower the Earth's temperature in that way. But I think really, as soon as you start to think about that kind of geoengineering, who governs that? For example, I mean, presumably, it will appeal to some, but I think that there will always be winners and losers in any intervention. Can we do it, first of all, be a question? But then even if you can, the governance. So I think really the key thing is to really act now. Let's mitigate and reduce global warming, and make the problem, if you like, manageable. I think we're going to have to deal with some global warming, but let's work hard and bring the problem down. And for those that ignore it, I think of their kids and grandkids. You're bequeathing them a world that you probably wouldn't want to live in.
Yeah, of course. And those of us who have had housefuls of teenagers will know that it matters more to people who are going to live in the future in a way than to old people like me. So learning and development departments have a big responsibility for helping to further the green policies of their organisations with the workforce. This is kind of part of an increasing job for HR to do with attitudes and values within an organisation. And green is a big part of that. What is the most useful thing you think that learning departments can get across to their learners, or their employees of their organisations?
About responding to climate change.
Yes,
I think really, I think possibly almost dealing with the previous question. Actually, I think that we're all in this together. That really there's human behavior matters. I think really. So and the organisation. So I suppose really it's important that the organisation is doing something. So I think it's not just you're not just exploiting it down to your
and not just saying it's doing something. Not just kind of making kind of greenwashy noises, but actually doing it.
Exactly. But then also, I suppose empowering their workforce also to be doing things outside of work. So I think it's 24/7, isn't it? Really, it's about everything that we do. I think also it's also important probably. I think also keeping the political process's feet to the fire is quite important. So I think actually, learning and development departments maybe shouldn't really campaign, but I'm just saying, I think a very powerful force for action is people who care, who vote. That keeps it on the agenda. Basically that means that governments keep funding R&D in this area. They keep supporting. We have the Climate Change Act in Britain, which so basically the government has quite a high degree of scrutiny in the UK compared probably to almost any other government in the world, where the CCC review what they're doing and make noises about what make comments on what could be done to enhance this action. And so all these processes need to be supported. They could be swept away in the future. And I think I made the point about you don't think you've won the war. So I think that's also quite another important thing. Maybe I'm going beyond learning and development departments, though. So come back to me if I haven't really answered the question.
No, I think that is a really useful response. And it kind of leans on to the next one. Just pause as an aside. It's a very interesting time to be doing this interview, because not only have we got COP27 running, but people on the M25 motorway in the UK have been having trouble kind of getting where they want to go to, because there are big protests and the Stop Oil movement, and people gluing themselves to buildings and roads and assaulting artworks and so on. So the next question was, will grassroots activities really have much of an impact? And I don't know the question here, but I'm guessing that has more to do with things like that, with Stop Oil and
I think those are very important. Again, it's to my mind, it's part of this is important, and it's raising it, all the time, so put in a way that you can't ignore it. So I think I commend these activities really to really engage and raise these issues, because, as I say, I think it's really keeping it in the public discourse. I think that's very important, because it's very I would say it's very easy to go to sleep, but there's always that danger of the issue falls off the boiler. So I think grassroots activities. I think the main value, to my mind, is really that they bring it to the wider society. Really, I think that has the big effect, and I think probably getting people thinking about where their pensions invested and things like this. There's quite a lot of people power really in how we maybe think about investing our money. And so these. I think some of the Stop Oil. That's sort of coming up with some, exactly raising those kinds of questions about where is your pension held, for example.
The objection is always raised that there's the danger that people are actually alienated by interfering with their right to get in their car and get to where they want to go at a predictable time. And that comes up a lot, actually. I was listening to a podcast, The News Agents, last night, and one of the presenters was apoplectic about the idea of it, and actually thinks it turns people off. But then Peter Tatchell says it's really all about the awareness. So there's a back and forth. We have to get to the end of these L&D questions. I'm very grateful to everybody who submitted a question here. And this last one, I'm going to quote verbatim, because I think you need to, really. Thanks, Lior, for this one. Who says, I'm in two minds. One screams, we're screwed, aren't we? The other is, I'd love to see some empowering practical example of what is working and improving. You see what I'm doing here? We're beginning to close out now. This is your cue to say something optimistic.
Well, yeah. Well, I think if we look at coastal flooding in the UK, in 1953, over 300 people were killed in a coastal flood on the East Coast. It's not forgotten in the places where people died. Places like Canvey Island, Jaywick were two hot
Canvey
spots.
Island, well, I grew up around there.
Yeah, well, that's a lot of people died there in 1953. That was a big coastal flood. Today, I mean, we've had events like that more recently, and they've almost not noticed because we've got much better flood defences. We have things like the Thames Barrier. We actually have ability to warn about these flood events. So it's one example where there was a problem and we have actually dealt with it quite effectively up till today. Sea levels are rising, so that means that we can't take our eye off the ball. We've got to keep on working hard to make sure that we. But I'm just saying it's an example where. In many ways, down to technology. I mean, computer models allow us now we have very good weather forecasts. We now have effectively sea forecasts of the height of the sea, so that the Thames Barrier has to be. These forecasts are used to close the Thames Barrier at the right time. So that's an example of where we've made huge progress. And a lot of people say, we have to have transformative adaptation, almost like we never have. And I often say, well, we've had transformative adaptation. What I just described to you is that we have to keep on doing it, but let's not lose sight of the fact that we have been able to deal with issues in the past. I think also, back to we're screwed, aren't we? Well, if we'd done nothing about emissions, we're probably heading for 4, 5, 6 degrees. So we're heading for 3 degrees. It's actually, we have made a big difference to our expectation. It raises lots of issues, and I talked about that in one of my earlier responses. But we have brought it down, and if we keep pressure on our governments to keep on acting, then it can be brought down further. So I think I'm an optimist, I think that. The important thing is not to give up and keep moving forward.
I think that's a great message. Lastly, where can people go to find out more about your work?
Well, if you go to I work for the Tyndall Centre for Climate Change Research, and so basically I have there's a page on me there where they can read about that, and they'll see some of the things that I'm doing. And then also they'll find some recent news pieces actually on the Tyndall website as well. So that would probably, I think, be the best place to start. And then obviously they can always drop me an email if they have a particular interest.
Okay, we'll put those links in show notes. Thank you so much for taking the time to do this today. I think it's been really interesting to me, and I think valuable. And I hope all the questioners will feel that they've had their questions well answered as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
That's all on the Learning Hack podcast for this time. Many thanks to our guest and to all our sponsors. The Learning Hack is completely independent and transparently funded by sponsorship. If you want to help others find us, please like, follow, rate, review and subscribe on your podcast platform of choice or on YouTube.
Our next episode of The Learning Hack is the last of the series before our much needed break for the Christmas holidays, and we'll be celebrating with a look back at the themes that have dominated the past 2 years. A pretty tumultuous 2 years, I think you'll agree, in the world of learning. Till then,
stay curious, learning people.
Now I finally get it.